Hi, I'm Mike Doran.
Hi, I'm Peter Rao.
Welcome back to Counterbalance. Peter, today we have my friend Jakub Grygiel. Jakub, hello.
Hello.
You, Jakub, are the inaugural guest after the rebranding of our podcast. We decided that we were a little rudderless, and we needed to develop a kind of theme for the podcast.
Which Jakub doubtlessly knows because I'm sure he listened to our.
Yeah, of course you know this, right, Jakub? Of course, because you're an avid listener and you hang on our every word. But the idea here is that this is about the real realism. We think that this moment in time is a good moment to resurrect a kind of realist understanding of foreign policy, but the phrase realism is owned by a school of thought that we don't really agree with. Right. Also, I don't know if Peter agrees with me, but I feel like I am a representative of the realist school of thought, but I'm not actually schooled in it. So we're turning to you, Jakub. You are a professor at Catholic University, and you're also a veteran of the Trump administration. You worked in the Office of Policy Planning, so you have knowledge of government from the inside. You have a huge theoretical brain. You speak multiple languages. I think you speak Italian, Polish, English. Have I got them all? Do you speak Russian as well?
Oh, I used to, yeah.
Yeah, you speak Russian. Have I missed any others? What else do you know?
Well, actually, I learned French before I learned English, so there's French.
All right,
too.
so you're multilingual. You're multilingual. You have a diverse background, and you write books about great power politics and about grand strategy. So I wanted to turn to you as our first guest to help us understand the real realism, the moment we're in, and where both the theoretical foundations of this way of thinking. And also what you see as the major dynamics in the world today. That's a mouthful of an introduction, isn't it?
Well, it's a big task too to explain realism and the world in one answer, right? And presumably you'll ask me more questions because I can speak for an hour as a professor, right? So that it's kind of dangerous.
Give us a starting point. Pretend for a second that we're in your classroom. We're very eager graduate students. We're not undergraduates. We're eager graduate students. No, let's make us sophomores. We're intelligent sophomores at Catholic University, and we need to know who are the intellectual titans that we should be reading.
That's a good question. Look, I mean, realism in its basic form means simply that. Politics is necessary, and politics means, among other things, the exercise of power. That you cannot escape this. And in international relations, it's probably the oldest way of looking at international relations. I mean, it starts from the Greeks, the Romans, and presumably even before. So it's just a recognition of the dangerous and limited nature of the political interactions in the world. So it's an old worldview, and the problem with it, it's a big worldview. It's a huge tent, and that's why you can have people that claim to be realists that will have fundamentally different explanations of the same reality, and will have therefore fundamentally different policy prescriptions. You can have realists that are isolationists now. You can have realists that are the opposite, transatlantic realists. You have realists in terms of, for instance, Ukraine. They'll say we should not do anything to help them. We should strike a deal or some sort with Russia. Others will say, realists will say, no, we should arm the Ukrainians even more so. So it's a big tent worldview. Who are the authors? I mean, I would actually start from the old ones, which I think are still the best. I mean, the best one to me is St. Augustine in the City of God.
Really?
Yeah,
I'm already surprised. I wouldn't have known that.
Look, I mean, it's the City of God, and actually his letters too. He wrote a bunch of letters actually to Roman commanders in North Africa, in which he was telling the Roman commanders, saying, "Look, get your life together. The ultimate objective of your life is salvation, but you're a Roman commander. Man up and defend the city against the barbarians." Right? So it's this very sort of basic common sense approach. You have a task, you're a soldier, do your job, and of course save your soul too. But, so it starts with that. And the basic understanding is politics is necessary. You can't escape politics. You cannot transcend politics. We live here now in a very fallen condition. And politics means, especially when you're dealing with international relations, what we now call international relations, is the realm of power. So one of the questions, for instance, that he as a bishop is asked, is it right for a Christian to be a soldier? Because that's the exercise of violence. And the answer is yes, absolutely. Right? And he goes into sort of lengthy descriptions of why that's the case, going through the Gospels, and etc. But I think that's one of the most nuanced and richest descriptions of the world from what we now call realist perspective. And I would really start with that because I think we live in a world that has not changed from that perspective. It is a violent world with clear threats to our city, our polity, our state, and similar questions, right? That come from slightly different perspective, perhaps, but similar questions. Is it right to defend it? If so, what is it that we ought to do to defend the city, the polity? Who is the appropriate authority? What is the appropriate authority to defend this? And to me, that's sort of the old-fashioned, deepest understanding of realism. So, you probably expected somebody more recent, and we can talk about more recent authors too, obviously, but I would start with that. That's the classic one in my view.
That's great. I would have said that Thucydides is right there too with Saint Augustine. And my first introduction to just war theory is with Saint Augustine urging the Romans to keep the barbarians who are crashing the walls from taking the city. Let me ask you, since you said on several counts it's the exercise of power, and I think it's commonly understood that the state still remains the primary actor in international relations today, exercising that power. Under how much attack, threat, or pressure is the state as the primary arbiter of international relations today in the realist thinking?
I think it's under attack from an ideological perspective. I think it's not as much under attack from actually a real practical perspective. What I mean by that is that there is, I think, and it starts, decades ago, and perhaps really starts with the Enlightenment. There's sort of a gradual delegitimization of the state as the rightful authority to exercise power, both in the economic sphere, cultural sphere, and ultimately the military sphere. And so that's a persistent, I think, a constant assault, attack on the state. What it means is that whenever a state wants to act in self-defense, for instance, and sort of on the front page news, it needs to seek global consensus, the approval over the global community, however you want to phrase it, right? Think about Israel now. It's, front pages. It's like, Israel is losing the global fight for the public opinion, as if that was a source of legitimacy, rather than the core source of legitimacy, which is the ability of the state to provide security to its own people. And so this ideological threat, I think, is very persistent, and I think fairly dangerous, because it undermines, in some cases, I think, it undermines the ability of the political leader to act on the defense, to defend its own people. And it forces some leaders, or persuades some political leaders, to rather seek the approval of the global community and its international institutions and the public opinion sphere, rather than actually doing his task. So that's under threat, I think. Practically speaking, however, the state is still the ultimate arbiter. The state is still the only actor capable, or states are the only actors capable of defending themselves and providing the primary and sustaining the primary purpose of the state, which is, again, protection of its citizens. There's no alternative. Alliances are not international organizations. Alliances are gatherings of states, right? It's not a supranational entity. It's just a collaboration among states that have similar interests to achieve the purpose that they have set themselves in front of them. So, the ideological threat, I think, is it probably reached its peak. That's my sense. Because it really, it starts really, probably in the late 1800s, obviously after World War I, League of Nations, World War II, UN. In the 1990s, there's this sense that the state has the prime time for the state has moved on, has passed. And now we live in a world of global interactions, globalizations, legitimacy that is defined by a global community rather than by the state. Democracy is a great thing, but there's such a thing as a higher public opinion, which is, again, the public opinion of this purported, this alleged global community. That's the 1990s, early 2000s. I think it's clear, especially over the past decades, that, that global community is not going to defend you. It's not going to deter Russia from invading Ukraine. It's not going to convince China to alter its course of action. It's not going to convince Iran to stop misbehaving. It's not going to convince Hamas to become a responsible actor in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. And ultimately, the test is when these bad actors or bad states misbehave, who's going to keep them in check? Well, it's the particular state: Ukraine, Israel, Japan, US, and so on and so forth. So it's this clash, I think, between the expectations that sort of grew really big in the late 1990s and early 2000s and actually the reality on the ground.
I don't feel like this is a statement, but it's a question for you. I don't feel like the Biden White House has completely thought itself out of the paradigm that you say is waning. Mm-hmm. When I look at the way when I look at what's happened with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Hamas's assault on Israel, the threats that China is making toward Taiwan, to me that convinces me that we are in an age of power political contests, and that's where we need to put our emphasis, and that the global community, quote unquote global community, is going to be of limited use in these power political contests. We have to deter nasty actors, and deterrence is primarily, as you say, it's primarily a military activity, and it is primarily carried out by frontline states. But when I look at the strategy or the trajectory of the policy of the Biden White House in Ukraine, for example, I get the feeling that they see themselves as the managers of a global society, and they're trying to tweak they're trying to tweak the environment around Putin, especially through economic sanctions, but not only, partially military economic sanctions, to convince him to rejoin polite society, rather than just simply defeat him, deter him. And so there are really two different concepts that are, you and I and Peter have a concept of what international relations is all about. It's a brawl, and we need to be the top dog in the brawl.
Right.
And they're aware that there's this brawling aspect to it, but they still see themselves as managers of a global system that includes these other guys. They're not putting together an alliance designed to deter rogue actors. They're trying to bring the rogue actors back into polite society. Is that a fair description, or do you see it differently?
Can I just add one addendum to that? It reminds me of a conversation I had recently with a very senior Ukrainian official who noted that this official being posted abroad, his home capital goes crazy when the Americans speak to the Russians at the UN, for example. And the reason that's offered is that, there's a lot of issues in the world. It's a big world. So you can't just see the prism of U.S.-Russian relations being competition. There are other files that we need cooperation on. I think the implications of that are theoretically and in practice rather big.
Mm-hmm. Right, but I would separate the two. Namely, I think it's correct, broadly speaking, is that Ukraine is, for us, one of the many interests that we have. Whereas for Ukraine, they only have one interest, defeating Russia. So, there is a difference in perspective that we as in the U.S., have from our allies on the front line, which is just a statement, I think, of the facts, of the simple nature of our power and our role. But I would say that Mike's point, on administration in general, I think it's correct. It has, I think, two factors or two parts to it. Namely, one is there is this view, which comes from mostly the left, the progressive view, that the world is and will become, if it's not, it will become a society in which everybody is a partner. And that started decades ago, and it continues to be the case, right? So it's the partner to solve global challenges. We don't have any more national security threat. There are global challenges. Where if there are challenges, we all join hands to solve the global challenge, right? So, I don't know, sweating polar bears in the North Pole or dying tunas in the Pacific, whatever it is, the issue that they have, we'll join hands and we become partners. And some of it is true in also the diplomatic language that has been used. As for instance, often allies and rivals are called partners, as if this, they were kind of on the same. Like you go to Japan, and that was under Clinton when she was Secretary of State. She would go to Japan and call Japan partner, then go to China and call China partner. Well, hold on, right? I mean, the two are profoundly different, even legally speaking, right? One has a treaty, one doesn't have a treaty. So there's that view, absolutely true. The second view, which is not necessarily mutually exclusive, but it's not limited, I think, to the progressive sort of foreign policy realm, is there's a sense of that power, especially American power, has very few limits or limitations. And that therefore, what we can do is really sort of manufacture outcomes. It's sort of like we are the perfect Michelangelo, a perfect artist, and we have a block of marble in front of us, and we know exactly how to shape that block of marble into the beautiful sculpture. And that there's no limitation. The only limitation is our own willingness to engage in that act. That's profoundly unrealistic. And
right.
If you want to talk about realism, I mean, its power has insane limitations, both because, well, the marble is shooting back at you in some sort of fashion, but also because there are certain things the power by itself cannot create, right? It cannot create a new nation. It cannot alter the culture of a country. It can destroy it, can tweak it, but it cannot alter it. It cannot change geography by and large. And so, and you can talk, tons of other limitations. It really cannot create angels out of devils. So that is, again, I think it's partly it's the progressive view, but it's also on, at least on American spectrum, it comes out, I think, also on the right side of the political spectrum. And it is, I think, deeply unrealistic. I was reading, past couple of days, I was reading this book by this French general, André Boff, who passed away. Obviously, he fought in 1940 in the French headquarters, Indochina, Algeria, Tunisia. I think he commanded the French troops in 56 in Suez. And after he retired, he started writing these books. One was an introduction to strategy, very thin book. Actually, I have it here if you want it. I get no benefits out of it, but it's a small book.
My favorite kind of book.
Small, yeah, no, exactly. It's in French. I'm sure there's an English translation.
Not my favorite kind of book.
But there's this beautiful sort of description of what it means to be a strategist and what it means to deal with international relations. And something somewhere in the book he says it's like performing a surgery on a patient that is constantly moving, constantly growing, of which you don't understand the anatomy, and nonetheless you have to come up with a great outcome. Meaning, good luck, right? I mean, the limits of what you can do are very, very serious. I think that the Biden administration and others, I think, don't have that sense of limitations. And again, he's a French, he's speaking out of what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 military defeats in his own life. So he's quite aware of the limitations of the military, at least the French military power at that point. But I think there's a wider point there that I think is worth taking.
You mentioned that this expresses itself on the right as well. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
It's often on the right. It's almost the opposite side, but it's as if our actions are the only source of behavior for other states. So why did Russia invade Ukraine? Oh, because we made it do it. We actually upset them. We pushed too hard. We enlarged NATO or the EU or whatever, however you want to put it. In other words, everybody else is an empty vessel. And that empty vessel, whether it's, again, China, Russia, Iran, only responds and behaves only as a response to our action. So again, we are insanely powerful. We sneeze and somebody else responds, as opposed to these countries have their own interests that are formed by their history, their particular regime, particular leader, that they want to pursue. And they're not necessarily spurred by us to pursue them, right? It's China, the development of the Chinese Navy over the past decade is not just a response to what we have done or what we have not done. So it's this sense that the world kind of revolves only around our own power, and as opposed to having interest of their own countries, other countries have an interest of their own and behaving on the basis of those interests rather than just as a response to us.
There's something profoundly American about this solipsistic worldview you just described. I mean, maybe I'm going to ask you in a second if there are other powers that have, are the Chinese the same if we knew their system from inside? But let me just tell you how strongly that rings true to me. When I worked in the White House, I learned two things. One, that there is nothing less factual in the world and more important when it comes to analyzing international politics than intentions. The Iranians would do nasty things toward us and our friends, and I would think, okay, that's it. Because I always wanted to get tough on the Iranians. And I found elements of our system never wanted to do that. And they would do something, and we would all see that they did it. It would be no doubt that they had done it. And I'd go into work thinking, okay, I've won the argument. But then I get into a room with colleagues, and I find out, I didn't win the argument because of this intention issue. I mean, you can catch somebody with their hand in the cookie jar, but then when you talk to them, they say,
they didn't want you to get fat, so they're eating it for you.
Yeah, they're doing it for you. Or no, I was reaching for the car keys. I wasn't reaching for the cookies.
Right.
And one of the things one of the persistent analyses that you have in the American system of Iranian misbehavior is that they are trying to get a relationship with us. Mm-hmm. That they're not doing it to undermine us. They're doing it as part of a negotiation with us. And if we'll come toward them, the big prize in Tehran, according to this analysis, the big prize in Tehran is the relationship with Washington. And if we'll deliver the relationship to them, we will moderate them. And I'm 100% sure that without ever hearing a Biden official say this, but that's the school of thought from which they come. But you do see this on the right, you see it on the left, you see it in all of our historical debates about origins of the Cold War and other things.
Right.
Where does this solipsism come from? Is it something inherently American, or is it just a kind of a great power autism, as Edward Luttwak says?
It's a little bit of both, but just one point on intentions, right? I mean, one of the I think constant in any most realist thinking is intentions are not irrelevant, but they're inscrutable. Right. Obviously, they're relevant. My intention to do something is relevant to my action, but others have a very hard time knowing and will have a hard time knowing that intention. So never base your own policy on the perceived intentions, because they're perceived, right? they can be right, but they can be also deeply wrong because of your biases, of what the other side wants to convey to you as their intentions, and they're selling them. So don't base your policy on intentions, based on actions, on their behavior, and on their capabilities. So there's this sort of deep skepticism in the realist camp, most realist camps, about intentions. But where does this solipsism come? I think it comes from two things, my sense is. One is a particular American tradition, which is blessed by the free security of the 19th century. That's a term that a historian Woodward used, free security, that we had. And therefore, this view that, look, there are only good things happening in the world, and, there's sort of unlimited possibilities, therefore. And to a certain degree, that's a blessing. That's a worldview that has a lot of optimism and a lot of possibility for good comes out of that view. But here's the second source, I think. The second source comes mostly from the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment tradition of the late 1700s, which sees politics as a mechanical thing, as a mechanism that is meant to fundamentally alter our human nature and gear it and direct it towards perfection. Politics as a source of salvation rather than politics as a source of just maintenance of your daily life, which is very different from, that's why I mentioned St. Augustine. Politics is not your source of salvation. Politics is just, well, what's necessary here and now, but it's not meant to necessarily that's not going to be your path to salvation. Your path to salvation is something else. Enlightenment says, no, that's the path to improvement and salvation. What it means is the exercise of power, therefore, both domestically and internationally, is meant to fundamentally alter who we are, how we behave, not just how we behave, but who we are, and move us toward whatever this progressive vision is. So it gives an enormous influence to actually political power, right? Political power is the tool to improvement. It's not the tool to manage politics or relations. It's the tool to improve who we are. So it's this elevation of political power to something that was not meant to be. It is not in the realist tradition. Political power is not meant to do these things. And so there's this expectation, in other words, the political power domestically and therefore internationally has this enormous sway and over us as social beings and as individuals and therefore as states. So that's what your point about, say the Biden administration seeing the desire to draw back into polite society, all these bad states, Russia, China, perhaps even Iran, right? Well, because politics is meant to alter everybody towards the progressive direction. Again, it's the elevation of politics. It's the to something that's not. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's deeper, in other words, than just American tradition.
That reminds me of this quote from John Quincy Adams, where he said, "I have to study politics and war so that my sons can study mathematics, commerce, and agriculture, so their sons can study poetry, painting, and music," which has a nice arc to it and fits that discussion, I think, to a T.
Right.
Jakub, let me ask you about a concept that I've heard a lot of in recent years, which gives the policy debate this imprimatur of theory and sort of grounded in science, and that is the idea of offshore balancing. That's become a favorite word, I think, of those who've argued for pulling back from some tier one theaters of the world. And I remember it probably most recently in the debate around Afghanistan, where the argument was that the U.S. could surveil, interact, engage Afghanistan from its bases in the Gulf. Can you tell us a little bit about the term offshore balancing and how it's been appropriated?
Broadly, it's a school of thought that started in academia and probably in the 80s that argued that the U.S. could maintain security in an equilibrium of a global equilibrium simply by sitting offshore, meaning not being involved directly and having a very limited, if at all, physical presence in Eurasia, in the so-called rimland. So either in the European theater or Middle East or the East Asian theater. In other words, sit on the ships somewhere in the Pacific and the Atlantic. That was sufficient. And being offshore was sufficient to maintain our security. And I think it had a bunch of assumptions in there, which historically, obviously, were not true. One, the key assumption, I think, was that um, Eurasia has sort of self-balancing mechanisms that do not require American presence. And well, World War I proved that that's not the case. Certainly, World War II proved that was not the case, and certainly the Cold War seemed to me proved that it was not the case. And without the U.S. and massive intervention in European and Asian dynamics, well, there would be no balance. So it was an assumption based on, I'm not sure, definitely not based on history. It was based on desires. The other assumption was that really being sitting off the shore, somewhere in the Pacific and Atlantic, will be sufficient to stop and prevent if there was a hostile power in Europe or Asia to attack our interests. That, again, I think historically has proven to be not the case. One of the great books of really the 1940s is this book by Nicholas Spikeman, who was a professor at Yale. He died young, I think in his 40s. I think in 1944 or 43 he died. And it's a massive book, America's Strategy in the World. It's actually a boring book because most of the book is trying to prove the case that you cannot have hemispheric defense. Namely, that the U.S. cannot just hold North America and South America and be fine. And he goes into like detailed calculation of rubber production and whatever else in South America.
What makes it boring is all the what makes it boring is all the lists of how much rubber is coming from Malaysia.
Exactly. Yeah, but the point is, I'm joking, half joking. Some chapters are boring, but the argument is exactly against this offshore balancing. At that point, it was called hemispheric defense, and I think it's still valid. And last point, I think on the offshore balancing, it had a sense that it seems to me that there was no ability to for a Eurasian hostile power, China, Russia, or whatever else would come up to cross the shores, cross the oceans and come to our shores. Again, it was sort of, I would potentially understand that logic if we were talking about, 1880, 1890. But once you have air power, ICBMs, not to mention terrorism and everything else, and add to that the economic aspect, it's just not reflective, I think, of the reality on the ground. Sitting on the Atlantic and Pacific is not going to prevent enemies from trying to cross them and actually assault our interests. And not to mention that we would not be able to maintain the welfare and the security that we have now with that policy, with that vision.
By the way, that might have been John Adams, not John Quincy Adams, but we'll leave that for another time. My own fact check.
Small details. This is not an exam. Come on.
We of course knew that.
Yeah.
We introduced these mistakes to keep our listeners on their toes.
It's very kind of you not to call me out on that.
In the Trump State Department, you were a political appointee in policy planning. I presume thinking about precisely these kinds of issues, given that the major theme of the Trump administration was the American interest versus the globalist understanding of the American interest, and sorting this out. It's interesting for me to hear you say that you're basically making a defense here of a global American posture, but yet you come out of the Trump policy planning staff. Can you give us some kind of sense of the flavor of this debate as it existed in the Trump administration?
Some of it had to do with language, but I think there's there's somewhat of a misunderstanding publicly, and namely that there's sort of this image of the Trump administration as being or seeking to be essentially isolationist or offshore balancing, if you want to use that academic term. And I think that was not the case. It was simply the case that if we have a global presence, the question is, does that global presence, wherever it may be located in the particular moment, does it improve or not our security? And if the answer is yes, let's keep that global presence. If the answer is maybe not, that presence there meant to be to do something else, some other global interest, which is not strictly speaking our own interest, then maybe we should reconsider. So I think the debate wasn't about whether we should have a global presence or not, but we should test it against a much more sort of firmer understanding of what is in our national security interest. So that to me was actually a debate, and it is a debate worth having, because I think a lot of our foreign policy again is running on the fumes of the post-Cold War decade, which sensed that there were no threats. We are in the world to create a new world, essentially, a rules-based international order, which again, I can't find a great description of what exactly that means, but it's something that it's almost beyond American interest, right? It becomes an interest of the rules-based international order of the world as opposed to the U.S. So keeping, in other words, a check on these elaborate and expansive global positions and posture, I think it's a good and worthy effort, which I think every president, Trump or not Trump, will have to face simply because of finances and sort of the natural historical event of scarcity of resources.
To your point about internal debates, you mentioned earlier that depending upon what sort of realist one is, you could arrive at very different outcomes when it comes to, for example, the war in Ukraine, whether or not the U.S. should pull back altogether, should increase its support, funding, military aid packages. Can you tease that out a little bit?
Just again, this is not this is almost an academic debate. Namely, it doesn't really fit neatly into the Democratic versus Republican debate in Washington. But I think you have a fairly powerful academic camp of self-described realists, Mearsheimer being one of them, but others like Steve Walt and others, which essentially seems to me would not want to help Ukraine because they think that it's just simply creating an imperialist Russia. Our help to Ukraine is the cause of an imperialist Russia. So it goes back to my previous point of sort of others are empty vessels and our actions fill those vessels with intentions and behavior. And so there's this position, again, in other words, that we should just withdraw. We should abandon Ukraine and let them fall, let them go into the Russian camp, and this will be enough, will satisfy Russia, and if we withdraw, Russia would no longer be an imperial power seeking to restore its imperial greatness and actually territory. That's a realist position. Follows at least.
Although a bit of an irony there, though, because as I understand it, Mearsheimer is an offensive realist by background, and he would consider Russian aggression to be a matter of wanting to establish an empire, push out as far as it can, and so by pulling back, you'd be feeding the beast essentially, right? And simply redrawing lines of defense further back. So it's almost a defensive realist argument that it is American and Western European NATO enlargement. And if you only satiate the Russians on the Ukraine file, you get security elsewhere that he's utilizing despite historically being an offensive realist. Is that right, or is that wrong?
Yeah, I mean, Mearsheimer is known for not being consistent with his own thoughts. So it wouldn't be the first time that he, is not consistent with, he's the guy, after all, that thought that the Israel lobby runs the show. And that's not a realist position, especially from a structural perspective, when you think the balance of power is decisive and the distribution of power is decisive in the world. And here he co-wrote a book on saying, no, it's actually a lobby that runs the decision. So, there's a lack of consistency, I think, in that view. Look, others, I think they're also realists, just to switch sides on the realist side, will say, actually, you have to keep an equilibrium. And equilibria are not self-maintained. You have to actually work hard to do that. And in order to do so, that's the best thing that you can do is actually defend or provide the tools to Ukraine to defend itself, because it'll keep it'll keep Russia in check, and among other things, it also improves our reputation, which I think is key. Footnote here: realists will have fundamentally different views on the importance of reputation. Right? Some will say it's irrelevant. Some will say it's tied to a specific region, so it can be contained. It's like a room, and whatever you do in that room, say Europe, it won't affect what happens elsewhere. So whatever happened in Afghanistan, the withdrawal, the loss of reputation, well, that only affects Afghanistan. It doesn't affect elsewhere. Others will say no. Reputation is, well, it's reputation. It cuts across theaters and it cuts across events, and to a certain degree even across decades and time. So again, to the original point, the realists are a huge group that has gigantic debates within them and disagreements among them.
This idea that there's a self-regulating mechanism out there in Asia or the Middle East or Europe, and that if the United States just steps back, it will kick into play, is really powerful. It's really prevalent. I run into it all the time when debating the Middle East with people, and one of the things that is very clear to me, but not to people who believe in this self-regulating mechanism, it's that we get more out of our local allies if we put skin in the game. If they think that we're abandoning them, their inclination is not to do more in their defense. It's to run and hedge toward the powers that are threatening them. It's really our job to put the coalition against Iran, China, Russia, and so on. I know that you're a great expert on the thinking of the ancients. The classical thinking about these questions. How did the Romans, did the Greeks, did any of the other classical authors on this subject have something to say about this, about how you get more from an ally by actually offering it something rather than just stepping back and expecting it to take care of everything itself?
Yeah, it's not what you just summed up. It's just an old wisdom, if you want, or almost a factual statement. Maxim as a factual statement. To give an example, in the Second Punic War, you have a bunch of Punic soldiers run by Hannibal, running around southern Italy, and those cities fall on the Punic side. They realize that, and the Romans refuse to fight Hannibal because they get beaten, and so they start, pursuing a so-called Fabian strategy, which is sort of harassing them but not fighting them. Well, the allies, especially in the south, say, "The heck? Why should we stick around with Rome when we have Hannibal running around and Romans are not coming to help us?" A lot of them switched sides. The closer ones didn't, but the farther ones did. So there's nothing in international relations that says that states will maintain their position no matter what. So, the view, for instance, is that, Europeans, if the US does not participate in the European political dynamics, the Europeans, all of them, will pick up the slack and will balance against Russia and presumably will not be friendly to China. I think that's not the case. Some will. Poland may. Some of the Baltics, maybe. Hungary, maybe not. Germany, maybe not. And so it's not a guarantee, in other words, the balancing will occur. Which again, going back to academic sphere, right? There's this whole view that balancing happens. Balancing is the law of international relations. It's the principle. No matter what you do, states will balance. Not the case. I think it's an assumption based mostly on a certain perspective of international relations, based mostly on microeconomics. And sort of the demand and supply curves that meet. But it's not, I think, reflected in reality. Look at the Napoleonic Wars. Prussia fought Napoleon, but then they aligned themselves with Napoleon. Austria-Hungary, Metternich, kind of fought and they decided, well, no, I'm going to stick around with Napoleon and try to be with him until, well, I'm going to switch sides.
Until they weren't.
Right, until they weren't. So my point is that we have this view which is very limited in the history of time. I think it's based on like 60 years or 7 years. Is that these alliances reflect a reality is written in stone. We are all on the same side, no matter what we do. I don't think that's the case. I don't think it's the case. I can see tons of states switching sides in some form or fashion, which is not beneficial to us.
Yeah, I suspect Chinese grand strategy on the war in Ukraine is to support the Russians up to a point so they don't trigger sanctions necessarily, and then if the war grinds down, or if the Americans cease to support the Ukrainian side, they will go to the Europeans and whisper in their ear, "You've tried the American way; it didn't work out. We have influence in Moscow. Tilt in our direction, and we can help solve some of your biggest problems," and thereby try to crack open the European order.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they could also go to the Ukrainians at some point, saying, "Look, we need your land for grain and pigs. Here's some money, a bunch of ships, and we'll help you rebuild. We'll rebuild some of your territory." I can see that, and the Ukrainians may switch sides towards the Chinese in this particular case.
This is sort of a basic, maybe even commonsensical statement, but Mike just made one, and you said it was just a basic statement too. So I'll do it as well. Is it true that there's basically a relationship or correlation between countries with the surfeit of power, like the U.S., and this hubris you've described? Which is to say, do you find countries on the frontier, to invoke a term that you're very familiar with, given that you wrote a book on it, and their fealty to almost sort of a core realism?
I think there is some to it. I mean, the frontier.
That's a better question than yours, Mike.
No, pay no attention to him. He's very jealous. He's a petty person.
Yeah, well, I guess it was a statement and a question, right? Both.
Yeah. You can pick either.
Pick either, yeah. Look, I mean, on the frontier, I think it's pretty clear that the historical experience of states on the frontier is one of violence. And that generates a certain sense or a certain worldview, which is different from states that are removed from frontier and have more power. So it's both, I think, location and the level of power that matters. And I think location here, I think, is the determining factor. I think states, especially on the European frontier, but I assume it's the same on the Middle Eastern or the Asian frontiers, that are located near expansionistic imperial power that over history keeps trying to push in one direction or another, have a very different sense of what international politics is than states that are remote from that, right? Again, here, our experience as Americans has been of internal squabbles, civil wars, violent, but very limited violence coming from abroad, if at all, right? And if there's violence, international violence, it usually happens out there. It doesn't happen of North Carolina shore or San Francisco. So it's this sense of that the world is actually not as violent as, well, the frontier people make it to be. I think that's absolutely the case. I would though then add one more thing, is this: the sense the frontier's violence does not necessarily mean that the frontline or frontier states will always have the same diplomatic or strategic posture. Namely, they always try to check the imperial power. There'll be actually debates, and historically there have been vicious debates within those frontline states in the 18th century, 17th century, 16th century, of which side do we go? Do we defend ourselves? Do we align ourselves? There will be factions, parties that go with one side or another because of a calculation of what's most beneficial to that frontline state, to a certain degree, sometimes to the group itself, the political party or the ethnic group or political group that arises. So frontline, yes, violence, yes, but it does not mean continuity of diplomatic and strategic posture in those countries.
Does the term realism have any use? I mean, because you described that realism, there can be bitter debates among people who are all realists and radically different perspectives about what the national interest is and what the best way to safeguard it is. does it have any analytical, descriptive utility, or should we just scrap it?
I wouldn't scrap it. I would just keep it at the highest level of generalization as a check against more progressive and modern Enlightenment views, namely, perhaps limit to like 3 maxims, if you want to use the term. Namely, 1, history is not a progressive line upward. So when it's constant or repeats itself, but however you want to phrase it, but it's not going to be a constant line of improvement. So therefore, among other things, methodologically, history matters because studying history will prepare your mind to, what do you call it, a brawl, a bar fight, or a struggle of international relations, right? So that's one. Related to that, human nature is not amenable to be perfected here and now. So limit your expectations.
That puts us on the opposite sides of the progressives right there.
Right there, which means that, there are limits, third point, limits to power. And so if you have these 3 points, history is not progressive, human nature is not amenable to be perfected, and power is limited, or has limited both sphere of action, right? It's not meant to make us into angels, and therefore in what you can do internally and internationally. You already have a different view and vision, I think, that the other side. Then you can have a debate on the policy, which is prudential judgment. Yeah, Peter.
I was just going to say the collapse of religiosity has some implications here, I would say.
Absolutely. Well, absolutely.
But sorry, I don't know if we're on the same wavelength, because we're in to a certain extent a post-Christian world, but it doesn't mean a collapse of religiosity, because
Well, I just mean it's being geared into politics.
Because the progressive.
Politics.
Oh, okay, that's exactly as I see it.
Right.
But where your analysis leads us to, Jakub, is that a lot of these perspectives on the international system, how it works, on foreign policy, ultimately or originally, these are profoundly personal and domestic political. They start with our understanding of human nature. I mean, you just said it. If we believe that we are fallen, and that human nature is not perfectible, and that politics is not a vehicle for perfecting human nature, we're going to have a very different view of the Ukraine war than if we do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. Look, I mean, I would say it is collapse of religiosity understood as, and it's Christian, but also classical, so Roman and particularly Greek. Namely, that there is, I mean, we're moving out of grand strategy here, but I think it's relevant. It's the understanding that there is a metaphysics or a transcendental reality, which is not here and now. And what happens is, I think in the modern world, that's eliminated. And therefore, politics becomes the creation of perfection here and now, versus that's, in the realm of ideas if you're Plato, or it's in the city of God, which is somewhere else usually, and not in the history 100%. So it's, and the moment you say there's no transcendental, there's no metaphysics, that's what you mean by religiosity that becomes politics. And politics becomes the main tool of human improvement, behavior, etc. And so that's why I think, in part, in the sort of post-Christian world, you have an elevation of politics to something that it's not meant to be. And therefore, everything is political. And the nasty debates have become essential, because they're become the ultimate debates at this point.
They're all meaning. Yeah, they're all encompassing.
Mm-hmm.
All right. We end with put not your faith in princes. Is that what we end with?
I guess, yes.
Jakub.
All right, Jakub, this is great. Wait, before we go, Jakub, tell us, because we're eager sophomores wanting to learn. City
of God.
You recommended City of God, St. Augustine. You recommended Spikeman, which sounds like a comic book hero. Give us a third reading, not from your oeuvre. We highly recommend your oeuvre, but give us a third.
Right. I never recommend anything that I've written. I find it boring. But Well, I think Peter recommended Thucydides, which I think is essential to understanding a lot of things. Look, if you wanted something more contemporary, I think diplomatic history, which is also a dying field, as you probably know, I think it's essential for anybody to
give us a book. Give us one author who wrote something that gave us an insight.
It can't be Art of the Deal.
No, it's not. One book. You read that, yeah. A.J.P. Taylor. A.J.P. Taylor. Anything that A.J.P. Taylor has written on
the struggle for mastery in Europe.
Europe, that's the key, and tons of other things on Germany, on Bismarck. I think that's a good starting point. Again, he has his own view. It's very particular, but I think it's a rich source of wisdom and of training your mind for the brawl.
All right.
Thank you.
This is what we do here.
Thank you, Professor.
This is what we do at Counterbalance. We get ready for the bar fight.
Exactly.
Now we go drink. Okay.
All right.